In the spring of 1884, on a creek that ran down out of the Front Range to the South Platte below Denver, the proudest cattleman in Pelham County wintered 800 head on the same rich bottomland his father had proved up. 20 dry years running, certain past all argument that the creek had never crossed the willow line and never would. And the young woman hired that March to cook for his calving crew stood a long while under one old cottonwood at the edge of his meadow, read what she found wedged high in its fork like another woman might read a letter, and then spent her own wages hauling haystacks up to a dry bench of wasted grass while the whole county laughed at her over its coffee. They called her the Flood Girl. They said the creek was a trickle a child could step across, and they were right. It was. They kept saying it right up until a warm June rain fell all night on 2 winters of mountain snow, and the creek came up in the dark a mile wide and brown and took every corral and stack and bottom pasture along its whole length, every outfit on that water but his, and stopped below the bench where 800 head stood bedded in the grass they had laughed at. She had read a record written 12 feet up a tree in the river's own hand that not one man on that creek had the patience to read. The cattleman was named Reuben Marlowe, a big, deliberate man just past 50, with a tan hat sweated pale at the crease and a voice he never had to raise because no one on Antler Creek had contradicted him in years. His father had come into that valley when Denver was a mud camp and had chosen the bottomland, the deep black soil and the wild hay meadows and the sheltering cottonwoods. The home place sat on the flat beside the water, and the grass came on green 2 weeks ahead of anything on high ground. Marlowe wintered 800 head on that bottom. His calves came off it heavier than any in the county, and when a newcomer once asked him whether the creek ever rose, he pointed at the willow line and said that in 20 years the water had never once crossed it. He was not a fool. He was something more dangerous than a fool. He was a careful man whose carefulness had been paid off 20 times running, and there is no argument on earth harder to answer than 20 good years. His father had left him a saying, with the land. The bottom is the best grass on the creek, the old man had said, and a man who is afraid of his own water will die poor on a dry hill. Marlowe had buried him believing it, and had gone on believing it for him. The cook came up from Denver on the supply wagon in the last raw week of March, hired through an agency for the calving season. Her name was Etta Crane, and she was about 24, composed and quiet, with fair, sun-freckled skin and dark auburn hair pinned in a low knot that the wind kept pulling loose at her temple. She wore a denim blue calico work dress with the sleeves rolled and a canvas apron over it, and she had steady gray-blue eyes and a calm, certain mouth, and she read a piece of country slowly, high ground down to the water, before she said anything of it. She cooked for 12 men through the muddy weeks of calving and kept the coffee hot through the night shifts. And Marlowe thought no more about her than a man thinks about anyone whose work never gives him reason to. He would learn better. The whole creek would. For Etta Crane was a drowned ferryman's daughter, and that is a particular kind of orphan. Her father had run the cable crossing on the Platte below Denver, and in the Great Cherry Creek flood of 1864. The night the water came down out of a dry sky and took the middle of Denver off its foundations, he had worked a skiff until morning, pulling people off roofs and out of cottonwoods. He had taught his daughter the river, the same as another man might teach a son the plow. And years later, on an ordinary green morning, with the water low and friendly, a snagged cable and a spring current took him under at his own crossing, and Ada at 19 learned the last lesson in his whole curriculum, which is that the river does not care how well you know it. So the cattleman and the cook were a matched pair, and neither one knew it, each keeping faith with a dead father. His had said the bottom was the best ground on the creek. Hers had drowned learning what water could do. If you have ever watched a whole county decide that a steady, capable person had gone soft in the head for minding a danger it could not see, then you already know why we tell these stories. Stay with Eddie Crane. What the men at the Pelham House Cafe were about to laugh at was already written down in pencil, in a dead ferryman's hand, in a little oilcloth book at the bottom of her trunk. Her father's name was Josiah Crane, and the book was his pilot's log, a small, hand-sewn thing in oilcloth covers gone dark and soft at the corners, and into it, over 30 years on the water, he had entered the river's behavior as another man enters accounts. Dates of every rise. The height it made against the stone footing at his crossing, taken with a marked pole. And on page after page, the high water marks recorded not in feet alone, but against things a man could go and look at. The fork of a cottonwood, the lintel of the mill. The 1864 flood had 6 pages to itself, written in a hand still shaking, and at the bottom he had set down the mark it left, wedged drift, and a stain of silt-high trees that stood a long ride from the channel. All of it above a tall man's reach, all of it dry again by August, all of it forgotten by Christmas. And beneath that, underlined twice, hard enough to shine the pencil lead, Josiah Crane had written his rule. A river keeps its own books. It writes its record in the trees, in the drift it leaves in the forks, in the silt it stains into the bark, and the record does not fade in a dry year. Trust the drift, not the dry years. The men who drown are the men who read the water in front of them and never the water that came before them. Ida had read that book so many nights that she knew whole pages the way other women knew Scripture. When he drowned, she had carried it out of the ferry house in her apron, and it had gone with her through 5 years of cooking for other crews. The one thing left on earth that was his. She found the tree on her second Sunday, on a walk down the meadow while the bread was rising. It was the biggest cottonwood on the bottom, an old twin-trunked giant, and lodged in the fork of it, a good 12 feet above her head, sat a drift log the thickness of her waist, silvered gray by weather. The men rode past it every day of their lives, and thought of it, if they thought of it at all, as a freak of some old windstorm. But a ferryman's daughter stood under that fork with her heart going slow and cold, because she knew there is only one force on earth that lifts a green saw log 12 feet into the air and sets it down gently enough to wedge, and it is not wind. Water had stood in that meadow at that height. She walked the whole grove that afternoon, and the river showed her the rest of its books. A faint, dark band stained into the bark of the older trees, all at one level, all above her reach, scars where ice had ridden downstream far above any St. Creek's reach. She went back with twine and a fishing weight and measured. And then she walked to the home place and measured again, and stood a long time in the chore yard with the twine in her hand. The stain in the trees stood higher than the eaves of Reuben Marlowe's barn, higher than the ridgepole of the bunkhouse, higher than every stack, every corral rail, every sill and doorstep that he owned, and the whole of it sat there in the low ground. Fat and green and asleep, under a mark the river had already made once and kept like a promise. Then she looked west, and the mountains finished the arithmetic for her. The snow of the year before had never rightly come off the high country. A cold summer had held it, and this winter had piled a second on top of the first, so that in April the peaks stood white far down their shoulders, banked deeper than the old men had seen in years. Everyone said it meant good grass. Ada Crane heard her father's voice saying what it meant: 2 winters of snow in the bank and the account not yet called. All it wanted was a warm rain to cash it, all at once, into one channel in one night. She told Marlowe once plainly in the yard with her hands still floured. She was not a woman who worked up to things. That drift log in the big cottonwood, she said, it did not blow there. It floated there. The water on this creek has stood 12 feet up that tree, and the silt line in the grove says the same, and both are higher than your barn. My father ran the Platte crossing at Denver for 30 years, and his log has the date. This creek has already drowned this meadow once since the war, and the snow in the peaks this spring is 2 winters deep. If a warm rain comes on it in June, it will drown it again. Move your hay to the bench while the ground is dry enough to move it. Reuben Marlowe looked at his cook for a long moment, and then he laughed. And to be fair to the man, it was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of 20 years. "Girl," he said, "I have run cattle on this bottom since before you were born, and the creek has never crossed the willows, not once. That log went up in some windstorm before either of us was thought of. The bench is wasted grass, thin and short and dry. I will not haul good hay uphill to feed it to the wind on the word of a cook and a dead man's fishing book." She did not ask him twice. What she did instead, quietly, became the joke of the county by the 1st of May. She owned 2 milk cows and drove them up to the bench herself. She had charge of a pen of orphan weaner calves, and asked leave to graze them where she pleased, and Marlowe, half amused, gave it, and they went up the hill too. And then she hired old Dutch Hollis and his freight team on her own wages. And evening after evening, when her kitchen was done, the county was treated to the sight of Marlowe's cook dragging haystacks up the long slope to the dry bench and restacking them in the short grass Marlowe called wasted. The Pelham House Cafe had it inside a week. Hauling hay to heaven, one man called it, and the room enjoyed that for a month. Somebody else said she was building an ark, and the county gave her the name it would use right up to the night of the water, and never once after. The Flood Girl. It was a good joke, better as the spring came on dry. It reached the ears of Silas Doane, who ranched the next water east and had wanted the Marlowe bottom for as long as anyone could remember. Doane was a patient, hungry man, and he did not laugh. He drove over and offered, neighborly as Sunday, to take the worthless bench land off Marlowe's hands for cash, fit as it was for nothing but a mad woman's haystacks. And it says a thing about Reuben Marlowe that some mulish instinct made him decline. But it was a near thing, and the cook nearly went down the road that same week. Moving her own milk cows was her business. Moving his calves and a dozen of his stacks, leave or no leave, that was his outfit run by his cook, and no cattleman on earth stands that quietly. He came into her kitchen with a fired look on his face, and what stopped him was that she did not argue and did not weep and did not quit. She fed him supper and said one sentence. "You can send me down the road in June," she said, "and I will go without a word, but the hay stays up the hill until the snow in the peaks is gone." Then May came in bone dry, and it was the dry that nearly beat her, not the laughter. No rain fell for 5 weeks. The creek dropped until it ran a hand's width deep over the gravel at the ford, a bright, harmless ribbon a child could step across. and every man who stepped across it thought of the flood girl and smiled. Along the skyline of the bench, plain as a row of grave markers, stood her moved haystacks, a full season's wages hauled away from fat ground onto thin, drying in the wind where the county could count them. Some evenings she could not hear the river her father heard, and went up the dark meadow to put her hand on the drift log and know she had not dreamed the whole ledger. The Stock Association met in town the first week of June, and it was the worst evening of Reuben Marlowe's grown life. He was a proud man, and the room knew it, and the room had been saving up. The president asked him, gravely, whether his cook would be issuing a forecast for the haying season. It went around and around, patient and merciless, and Marlowe sat and took it, and came into the yard at dusk already shouting. The hay was coming back down, he told her, starting tomorrow, every stack, and the calves too, and there would be a new cook by shipping time. And he was done being the only outfit run by a girl and a drowned man's diary. She did not answer him in the yard. She picked up the lantern and the oilcloth book, and she said, "Walk down the meadow with me first. It is one walk. You have given me a whole spring of daylight, you can give me 10 minutes of dark." And because he was ashamed of himself for shouting, or because some part of him had carried his father's saying like a stone all spring, Reuben Marlowe walked. Under the big cottonwood, the lantern light went up the pale trunk and found the silvered log lying in the fork like something set on a shelf. It opened the book to the pages of 1864 and held the lantern over her father's shaking hand, the dates, the marks, the drift, high in the trees. And she took Reuben Marlowe's hand, the first time she had ever touched him, and set it flat against the trunk, on the dark band stained into the bark, a full arm's reach above both their heads, and held it there. "Feel that," she said. "That is not sap and it is not shade. That is silt, ground off the mountains and left in the bark by standing water, the creek's own signature, and it is higher than your hat, and higher than mine, and higher than your barn. My father wrote that a river keeps its own books. This is the page. I am not asking you to believe me, I am asking you to believe your own creek. It has told you what it did once. Look west at that snow and tell me it cannot do it again." Reuben Marlowe stood in the dark with his hand on the stain a long time, and the little creek ticked over its gravel in the willows, sounding about as dangerous as a kettle, and whatever passed in him under that tree, the county never got the whole of it, because all he said, gruff at last, was, "The stacks can stand until the 1st of July. Not one day passed." And he walked back up to the house alone. It was not faith. It was 1 month. On such margins, whole valleys are saved. Here is the thing her father had understood. A flood is not weather. A flood is arithmetic, and the land it visits has already done the sum at least once and written down the answer. Drift does not climb. A log the thickness of a woman's waist gets into the fork of a cottonwood 12 feet up one way only, floating, on water that stood that high, and when the water goes down the log stays the river's own bookmark, in plain sight for whoever has the patience to look up. That is the whole secret, and it is no secret at all. The creek had flooded that meadow within living memory and written the fact into every old tree on the bottom, and 20 dry years had not erased a word of it, because a river's accounts are kept in timber, not in talk. And the mountains that spring held the other half of the sum. 2 winters of snow stood banked in the peaks, a whole second river stored up there in cold silence, waiting on nothing but temperature. A dry June could have paid it out gently. What came instead was the one thing the ledger feared. The wind swung to the south in the afternoon, and at dark a warm rain began to fall, and it fell all night, gentle as a blessing. Warm on every snowfield, on every peak at once. Rain on snow. The rain came down the mountain, and the snow came with it. Ada Crane woke past midnight to a sound under the rain, a sound like a long freight grade a county away, and she had heard that sound once before, from a rooftop in Denver when she was 4 years old, and she was dressed and across the yard before she rightly knew she was awake. She beat on Reuben Marlowe's door with the flat of her hand. "It is coming," she said, when he opened it. "The creek is in the willows already and climbing while we stand here. We have 1 hour, maybe 2. The cattle come up the hill now, or they do not come at all." And Reuben Marlowe, who had given her 1 month, stood in his doorway in the warm rain and listened, and heard his little kettle of a creek growling in the dark like something with a body, and 20 years broke in him all at once, quietly, the way a dam corps goes before the crest does. He did not argue. He got his boots and his horse and beat on the bunkhouse door himself. What followed was the wildest work that crew ever did. 6 riders and a cook in streaming darkness, pushing 800 bawling, rain-slick cattle up off the bottom, the water coming up out of the willows behind them, not as a wave, but as a black shining widening that ate the meadow from the creek outward. They brought the last bunch up the bench road with water over the horses' fetlocks at the gate, and Reuben Marlowe himself rode drag beside his cook. And when he turned at the top of the hill and looked back, his lantern found no meadow at all. It found water. Dawn came gray and warm, and the rain eased, and the people of Antler Creek climbed whatever high ground they had and looked at a thing none of them had ever seen and none of them ever forgot. The valley was a river a mile wide, brown as fresh plowed ground, wrinkled like the hide of something walking. It took the lower corrals apart rail by rail and floated haystacks off a dozen meadows whole. And the stacks went down the valley like a line of barges, upright and stately and lost. It stood 4 feet deep in kitchens whose door sills had been dry for 20 years. It drowned no one because it was June and not January and folks could climb, but by full light there was not an outfit on that water that had not lost its hay, its fences, or its calving grounds. And the neighbors came up out of the gray in wagons, the lanterns of them a wavering line up the bench road to the one place on Antler Creek where the disaster stopped mattering. Because the water stopped below the bench, it came up the long slope through the drowned meadow up nearly to the shoulder of the hill, and there it stood, licking at the grass, a hand's width below the silt stain in the bark of the old cottonwood, as if the tree and the flood had agreed on the figure years before. And above that line in the short dry grass the county had called wasted stood Ada Crane's haystacks in their neat rows, and her milk cows, and the orphan calves, and 800 head of Marlowe cattle bedded down, chewing in the first sun. The only dry herd and the only dry hay on that whole creek. The neighbors' wagons came up the road into the middle of it, and nobody in them was laughing, and Marlowe met them at the gate and did not say one word about almanacs. He said there was coffee. His cook was already boiling it. The water was 3 days going down, and it left the valley plastered gray, fences gone, meadows buried in silt. The Marlowe home place itself scoured through, barn standing, but heart deep in mud. And this is the part the old men on that creek told the longest, longer than they told the flood itself. Nobody on Antler Creek went under that year. The hay on the bench wintered the neighbor's cattle alongside Marlowe's own at no price until the grass came back. Even Silas Doane took the loan of hay and had the grace to be quiet about it. And if the county noticed that the man who had tried to buy the bench for pocket money now fed his cows off it by another's kindness, it was allowed its one smile. The Stock Association met again in late June in the same room, and Reuben Marlowe stood up in front of the same men, and he had the oilcloth book in his hand. The room was very quiet. He read them the pages of 1864, the dates, the poll readings, the drift in the forks of trees far from any channel, and then Josiah Crane's rule, underlined twice, trust the drift, not the dry years. I laughed at this book, he told them. I want it known. I had 20 dry years and my father's word, and I called this hay haul to heaven, and the person I hired to boil coffee read one tree on my meadow, and was worth more to this valley than every year of experience in this room. Mine first. The mark on that cottonwood was there when my father chose the ground. The creek told us what it was. We were too proud to be spoken to by a tree. He did not once say her name with any flourish, and she, sitting at the back with her hands in her lap, never stood up, and that was as both of them wanted it. The county surveyor rose instead. Before the summer was out, he had chained the silt line down the whole valley, tree to tree, and the association entered it in the county record as the building line for Antler Creek, and for 50 years afterward, when a newcomer asked why every house and barn on that water sat oddly high on the shoulders of the hills, somebody would tell him about the 9th of June, and the flood girl, and the drowned ferryman whose book had saved a valley he never saw. Reuben Marlowe rebuilt the home place that fall, on the bench above the drift line, the house facing down the slope, so the big cottonwood stood in view of the kitchen window. He said it was for the water. The county judged it was also for the cook, because he asked Etta Crane to stay before the foundation was square, and asked her again at Christmas in a different voice. And they were married in the spring. A year from the Sunday, she first stood under the tree and looked up. The men who had named her the Flood Girl danced at the wedding, and the name retired itself that night, the county being, after all, capable of shame. The pilot's log did not retire. On a clear morning that 1st September, Etta Crane Marlowe walked down the meadow with her father's book and a marked pole, and measured the new silt line on the old cottonwood, the 1884 mark, a hand's width above the old one, and entered it in her own steady hand, with the date below 30 years of her father's entries, so whoever came after would not have to take anybody's word for anything. The river had kept its books. Now the family kept them too. If you have ever trusted a quiet record over a loud crowd, tell us where you are listening from, and stay close to this channel, because there's a story like Etta Crane's on every creek in America. And when you walk your own ground this week, look at your old trees. Would you know the river's handwriting if it was 12 feet over your head? Or would you need 20 dry years and one warm rain to learn to read?